Greetings. Thank you for visiting the Skirball Cultural Center's YouTube channel. My name is Sabrina Werf, and I am the Skirball's membership manager. The following talk was presented to Skirball members on Member Preview Day, May 3rd, 2023, in celebration of the Skirball's spring exhibitions, Blacklist, The Hollywood Red Scare, and Peter Krasnow, Breathing Joy and Light. In this program, you will hear about Peter Krasnow, Breathing Joy and Light. I hope you will also take time to watch our curator talk about the Blacklist exhibition. Both programs were filmed by videographer Hal Banfield and his crew. Peter Krasnow, Breathing Joy and Light, and its related educational programs at the Skirball Cultural Center are made possible through generous donor support. Our valued members and donors make it possible for the Skirball to offer meaningful and engaging exhibitions and programs. Membership and donations sustain the Skirball's commitment to upholding timeless Jewish values by offering cultural experiences that celebrate discovery and hope, foster human connections, and call upon us to help build a more just society. We often hear the phrase, "It takes a village." Our Skirball village, our community, would not be complete without our members and donors. We are grateful for their support, generosity, commitment, and active involvement. In this program, you will hear from Skirball Associate Curator Laura Mart. First, you will hear from Vice President and Museum Director of the Skirball Cultural Center, Sherry Bernstein. Having joined the Skirball in 2001, Sherry led the education and visitor experience teams and served as project director for the internationally acclaimed Noah's Ark at the Skirball exhibition before becoming the museum director in 2021. Prior to the Skirball, she spent 6 years at LACMA in the Modern and Contemporary Art Department and has also held positions at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the Institute of Contemporary Art, Boston. Sherry earned undergraduate and graduate degrees in art history at Yale and Harvard Universities, respectively. And now, I invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
So nice to see all of you today and to see so many familiar faces, and we just love the fact that you're a part of such a central part of this community and are excited that you're the first people that we're going to share these two exhibitions with. In my brief time with you, I want to reflect on how these two exhibitions, one focused on a critical moment in American history and the other on a body of work by a single fine artist, how they both speak directly to what we care about at the Skirball, the values that guide us and the work that we do. Sidney Poitier once said of his dear friend, Harry Belafonte, that he always raised his voice against the dark. At the Skirball, we really always seek out opportunities to spotlight people who've raised their voices against the dark, particularly in the United States. People who've stood up for justice and the equal humanity and dignity of all people, and have kept the flame of hope alive, even in hard times, and actually especially in hard times. These are stories that inspire us and really, we feel, fuel our efforts to be our best selves. The Hollywood Blacklist exhibition presented us with just that sort of opportunity. This is a show that, among other things, uplifts stories of writers, actors, directors, and others, many among them Jews and members of other minority groups, who bravely took a stand for what they saw as every American's fundamental freedoms and rights. And they did so at a time of widespread and unfortunately all too familiar anti-Semitism, racism, and nativism in the United States. Our exhibition on Ukrainian-American artist Peter Krasnow also tells us a story of someone who raised his voice against the darkness. Krasnow, like members of many families who were blacklisted, was a Jewish immigrant who fled European pogroms in search of freedom and a better life. In response to the ravages of the Holocaust and global war, and while living a continent away in his beloved Los Angeles. Krasnow devoted his artistic practice to what he called repairing broken worlds. And that's, of course, invoking a Jewish concept of tikkun olam. At that time, in the years immediately after World War II, he dramatically shifted his style and palette to create paintings that, in his words, breathed joy and light and offered a means of protest to ease the pain. Another way that the Blacklist and Krasnow exhibitions speak to the Skirball's mission and values is that they're focused on telling authentic human stories, stories that help us to see ourselves in one another and to see each other as full three-dimensional people. The Blacklist exhibition offers insight into the very real and often seemingly impossible challenges that many in the industry faced in all different professions during this period. The potential loss of livelihood and the decimation of careers, the emotional impact on families, and of course the fear of anti-Semitic or racist retribution. These are challenges that help us better understand the range of different choices that people made at that time. Similarly, Peter Krasnow, Breathing Joy and Light, sets the artist's candy-colored post-war abstractions in the context of the life and times of Peter Krasnow in order to paint a richer and a more complex vision of this body of work and of the artist himself. Finally, our two new exhibitions reflect the Skirball's commitment to presenting content that, while often historical in focus, speaks directly to pressing and fundamental issues that we face today. Questions of who is made to feel they do and don't belong in this country, of what it means to be a patriotic American, and of how to raise one's voice impactfully against the darkness. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Associate Curator Laura Mart, who's going to tell you more about the exhibition that she curated. Since joining the Skirball team in 2014, Laura has curated multiple art exhibitions at the Skirball, including Talking Back to Power, projects by Aram Hansi-Fuentes, El Sueño Americano, The American Dream, photographs by Tom Kiefer, Another Promised Land, Anita Brenner's Mexico, and Surface Tension by Ken Gonzalez-Day, murals, signs, and mark making in Los Angeles. Laura also co-curated the original Skirball exhibition, I'll Have What She's Having, The Jewish Deli, which is currently traveling nationally. And she contributes to the Skirball's permanent exhibition on Jewish history and culture, visions and values. Laura completed her undergraduate studies at Washington University in St. Louis, and she earned an MA in art history from the University of Chicago. Welcome her to the stage and give her a big hand.
Thanks, Sherry. Hello, everyone. So good to see you all today. Hi again for those of you who I have seen before at these talks that we do for every exhibition, and hello to the new faces who have recently joined the Skirball. We're so happy to have you here and to have you as members. We could not do the programming that we do without your support, and so I want to say thank you. I also want to change the slide since you've been looking at this for a while. So I'm going to have to read off my written notes here. So this exhibition, Peter Krasnow, Breathing Joy and Light, focuses on the work of the significant but underappreciated Jewish-Ukrainian immigrant artist, Peter Krasnow, and who was an important figure in the Los Angeles art scene from the 1920s through the 1970s. This exhibition draws exclusively from the Skirball's own fabulous collection, which was seeded in the late 1970s when one of our curators, Nancy Berman, who some of you might know, met Krasnow and mounted an exhibition here at the Skirball and also at the Magnus. This was at the Skirball before it was here, and the Skirball, HUC Skirball. Anyway, institutional history. Anyway, we had an exhibition of his work in the late 1970s. That was the seed of our collection, and from that it has grown to over 85 works, 20 of which are on view. This is one of the most significant holdings of fine art in our permanent collection, and we're so thrilled to be able to have the opportunity to spotlight it in such a beautiful and meaningful way. And about the meaning. So these paintings, these vibrant paintings from the 1940s through the 1970s, were an emotional response to the destruction of World War II and the Holocaust. Peter Krasnow created these vibrant paintings full of joy and life as an antidote to the suffering and despair of the time, or in his words, to repair broken worlds. I think Sherry touched on that. So there are a few points of connection with our own times. We are emerging, continuing to emerge from the difficult times of the pandemic, and our world continues to be ravaged tragically by war, especially the war in Ukraine right now, which is, of course, another point of connection with Peter Krasnow's life as he was born there. And his paintings are timeless because they deal with this ever-repeating pattern of the human condition, which is finding joy and life after trauma and loss. So Krasnow, like I said, was born in Ukraine, and he fled during a previous period of violence, which included pogrom attacks against Jewish communities like his own. The violence in Europe also deeply affected him when he lived in Southern California, and it was during that time, the time of World War II and the Holocaust, when he invented his trademark style of wild, vibrantly colored paintings in response to the destruction of the war. He thought artists had a special gift and responsibility to create emotions in their viewers, and he wanted to leave his viewers with feelings of happiness and upliftedness. And you will see that in his work in the gallery. You may or may not have heard of him before. Peter Krasnow is a very, I think, significantly understudied but very interesting and I think important artist in Southern California in the mid-century period. So let me introduce you to a bit about his biography, which you'll see a timeline when you go into the gallery, so you can learn more in depth there. I'll give you a kind of a superficial overview here. His birth name was Fivish Reisberg. He was born in a town called Novograd-Volhynsky in Ukraine, a town of about 20,000 people, then part of the Russian Empire. And ever since he was a small child, he was driven to create. He was always making wood carvings. He left a little trail of wood shavings after him, so his family called him the nuisance, which he didn't like very much. So he always felt misunderstood, from his early years, but he was always a creative person. And he found out about art as a creative profession. His dad and his grandfather were engaged in creative professions. His grandfather was an architect. His father was like a house and sign painter, interior decorator. But both of those are commercial trades. He wanted to be a professional fine artist, non-commercial. And he found out about that by reading art magazines in a bookbinder's shop he used to like to visit. So he grew up in Ukraine, traditional Jewish family, and he was really driven by this desire to become an artist, but there weren't a lot of opportunities in Ukraine for Jewish people in particular to study art, or I should say also in the Russian Empire at that time. There was a lot of anti-Semitism, the limits on Jewish participation in higher education, and of course also pogroms, which came to attack his town, Novograd-Volhynsky, after he left. But the pogroms were happening, and so he realized he had to get out. He immigrated to the United States, and this is a drawing that he made shortly after, I believe shortly after he arrived, but he immigrated in 1907, and this drawing is from 1907. So this is one of the earliest works that he made that survives. It's the earliest work we have of his in our collection. And as you can see, it depicts a Jewish wedding on the streets of his hometown, Novograd-Volhynsky. Krasnow really felt that his calling in life was to make art, and so that was also, in addition to the violence, a motivating factor in him moving to the United States. Shortly after he arrived, he enrolled in art classes at settlement houses, and eventually he enrolled in the Art Institute of Chicago, where he graduated in 1915. And so all the while that he was studying in art school, so that's about 8 years, he worked in whatever job he could find, maintenance, painting, house painting, interior painting, because that's what he knew. And so he was, doing that immigrant struggle, right? Working hard, supporting himself, but really pursuing his passion and his dream of becoming an artist. One of the jobs he worked is depicted here. Actually, this is a job he didn't work. This is a job he wanted, but he was turned away. So he moved to New York after he graduated from art school. He moved to New York and lived there in the late teens and early 1920s. And this painting here called Snow Shovelers, Delancey Street, or After the Snowstorm. There are two titles. From 1920, depicts an experience that he had when he was, there was a big blizzard in New York, and he saw that there was a need for people to shovel the street, clear it of snow. So he applied for the job. He went to the job line. So that's what you did in the 1920s. And he was turned away because his clothing was inadequate. The foreman thought that he would freeze to death shoveling snow. So what he did was he went back to his studio, and he had this image of the snow shovelers seared in his mind, and he painted this composition with the mass of people working. And I think that's, he put himself in the center of the painting. I think that fellow's facial features do quite resemble Krasnow's. And also the way that he made that one lone figure stand out. I think that he put himself in the scene as one of these fellow workers. So Krasnow wanted to paint his own experience and ideas, but he found that his success from painting really came from what his patrons wanted. These were people who were paying him to paint portraits or sunsets, and he wanted to paint his own experience and ideas. So because of this independent spirit and this drive he had to follow his own voice, he decided, after he had some success in New York, he decided to leave New York because it was the people there were too, and his words, not mine, sorry from anyone from New York, I know there are probably plenty of you in this room, but he thought that the New York art scene was kind of limited in its imagination and small-minded, so he left, and he drove across the country to an area of Los Angeles called Tropico, which is now Atwater Village in Glendale. So right near, if you know where the Costco is on Los Feliz, that's where he lived, right near there. Wasn't the Costco at that time. So he moved to Los Angeles, and in Los Angeles, his paintings changed dramatically. He adopted a much more colorful palette, and he began his journey towards visual abstraction with his subject matter still recognizable. You can tell what's in the painting, but his forms are flattened and simplified. And I should note here, so you're looking at a painting called Casa Verdugo. This is from the 1960s, actually, but the reason why I included it here at this point in his chronology is that he painted basically the same painting, just in a different style when he arrived, and then he was known for, if he had a composition he liked, he would often trace it and transfer it to a new surface, and then redo it, slightly different, in a different style. And so that's what he did with this painting, Casa Verdugo. So this was the first place he ended up living in Los Angeles was, believe it or not, an abandoned Mexican restaurant. It was an adobe that had survived from the Mexican period and had been converted into kind of like a tourist destination Mexican restaurant in Glendale. Then there was a business dispute, so then the business left, the restaurant was no longer operating as a restaurant, and the landowner had artists move in so they could have cheap rent and she could have her building subsidized. But while Peter and Rose were living there, one day with no warning, the demolition crew came and they had to find some new digs. So they bought a parcel of land from the photographer Edward Weston, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Weston and Krasnow became very good friends. So the Krasnows moved to a different part of what was then Tropico and is now Atwater Village. And they hand-built a redwood studio where they lived for the rest of their lives, their home and studio. So that for the two subsequent decades of his career, so he moved in 1922, so we're talking about the 1920s and the 1930s now, Krasnow achieved recognition for his work in painting and wood sculpture, and he designed a number of commissions for Jewish places of worship, as well as USC's Student Union. So he designed work for Temple Sinai, for Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center, and for Temple Emmanuel in San Francisco. In the early 1930s, he and his wife, Rose, spent 2 years in France. Later, they returned to Glendale, and Atwater Village, and I say Glendale because I'm from Glendale, so I like to think that he's from Glendale, but he really lived in Atwater Village, like 2 blocks away from Glendale, so I need to get it right. So he returned to LA and moved away from this, what you see on the screen, moved away from this kind of stylized Art Deco, very Jewish subject matter, to these wild abstract wood sculptures, which he really focused on for the next 2 decades. That was really kind of like a big moment in his artistic development, and he then moved to abstract painting. But this was during World War II, so let's talk about that. The destruction of World War II and the war and the Holocaust dramatically changed Peter Krasnow's outlook on the world and also on his own art. So he was in Europe right at the kind of the beginning of the sense of the trouble, and he saw it in the 1930s. Things just go further and further into fascism and you know, the terror of the Spanish Civil War and other events like that. But when World War II broke out, it totally changed his outlook, especially after after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So, you know, a few years into the war, he found that he did not want to depict the horrific events of war. So he writes in his unpublished autobiography, One Artist's Story, about this time: I followed day by day the dread movement of doom, the eternal procession of the new exiles, native and alien, king and pauper, wholly familiar. I knew the landmarks in the endless road of their misery. With each recurring catastrophe in each new land, I lived over and over again the early years of my life in a country where the whip of persecution had made my life and the lives of my people a constant torment. I no longer attempted to produce realistic interpretations because the face of tragedy had grown too sinister for the human brain to encompass it and for a human hand to record it. When the pressure becomes too powerful to bear and the hour strikes when all that man has hoped and worked for is in the process of being consumed, the purpose of the creative worker grows larger. The creative worker knows, as all men must learn, that in an age when all else vanishes, his vision alone will survive. And so with that in mind, he turned to painting his abstract, vibrant compositions. And he goes on to write, I painted again as darker grew the days and bleaker the nights. Between alerts, blackouts, and rationing, brighter grew my palette. I had always leaned to the darker side. My early paintings bore the imprint of pathos and tragedy, which the light of California had hardly been able to dispel. Now, when tragedy was at the deepest point, my paintings breathed joy and light, color structures instead of battle scenes, symmetry to repair broken worlds, a means of protest to ease the pain. When despair reaches its highest point, it can hurt no more. And if life persists, there is an upward turn of the wheel that leads to the realm beyond tragedy, beyond time and region and race. It is then that in the realm of of creation, the archetype emerges, universal and timeless. And so you can see in this painting here, K7, 1949, some of that symmetry and color that Krasnow describes. There's this overall symmetrical grid structure. There are these amazing, vibrant forms that look like people dancing or praying. When I look at this, I often see in the lower center chromosomes or DNA. So there's sort of cells. And so Krasnow really welcomed people to look at his art and have their own reactions, make their own personal associations. He really rejected people who were supposedly educated, had ideas about art, comparing him with other movements or styles or civilizations. He very much saw his art as being his own creation and his own brainchild. So when you go into the gallery, I invite you to do a little free association exercise with your friend or with yourself. What do you see in the paintings, and what do they make you think of? And do they make you happy? That was really what Krasnow wanted, was an individual, personal reaction to these works of art. So he developed this style during World War II, and he continued to paint in this style until the 1970s, until his death in 1979. And he avoided the elements of the art world that would typically grow an artist's successful career, things like gallery representation or self-promotion or trying to get reviews. But nonetheless, he became a fixture in the Southern California art scene and had a successful exhibition at the Pasadena Art Institute, which is a precursor to what we know now as the Norton Simon. And his studio was a stop on the visits, the circuit of visits that art lovers were known to make. But of all the visitors he liked the most, he liked to be visited by people who were not quote unquote art people, people who were not art professionals or somehow in the business. He wanted people who connected on a personal level with his art. That to him was the truth of it, an individual personal reaction. So when you go into the gallery, I hope you have an authentic reaction, whatever that may be. Another major theme that we investigate in the show, and what is fitting for a Jewish institution to foreground, is his deeply Jewish cultural roots. He was educated as a child in the Heder. He learned to read and write in Hebrew, but he chafed in his traditional Jewish community, which had the typical prohibition against that, thou shalt not make graven images unto thee. Have no other gods, in front of me, right? The second commandment, which historically has meant that Jews have not made visual art, or Jews have kind of gravitated away from visual art in favor of literature and music. And of course, we know that there are many remarkable Jewish visual artists, especially in the 19th century, the 20th century, as Jews became more secular. This kind of idea that making visual art is inappropriate has been left aside, I think, by many secular Jewish people. But there is still an element of, in Krasnow's traditional community, an element of suspicion against that. So for him to pursue fine art as an occupation was not something that was encouraged, even by his own family, who themselves were in creative occupations. But despite that tension, Krasnow was deeply invested in his Jewish origins. He wasn't a joiner, so he wasn't part of any synagogue or temple or other part of organized Jewish life in LA, but he was really interested in the mythological, biblical, and folkloric aspects of Jewish culture, as well as in the Hebrew language. And so many of the works that you see in the gallery either have Hebrew characters in them or have shapes that look like they could be Hebrew characters, even though you can't figure out exactly what letter of the Hebrew alphabet it is. And to close, I'll leave you with this. So Krasnow's painting that we use in many of our promotional materials, and I think you've probably seen it at this point in emails, is a painting called Two Brothers. You see behind me. So this painting, K14, or Two Brothers from 1964, Krasnow's abstracted composition references a story from Jewish folk tradition. Some of you may know. The story goes like this. Two brothers were each given a portion of their father's estate to work and grow their grain crops. One had a family, the other did not. The brother with a family worried that his brother, who didn't have any kids, would have nobody to provide for him in his old age. So at night, he would secretly transfer some of his own grain to his brother's storeroom so that brother could sell it, raise money to support himself when he was older. The other brother, the one with no kids, thought that the brother didn't have enough food to feed his family. So he would take grain from his own storeroom, put it in his brother's, so that maybe he could have a little extra so his kids wouldn't go hungry. And so neither could figure out, they were baffled each morning when the amount of grain was the same. What the heck? So this went on for some while, until one night they crossed paths. They ran into each other. And in that moment, they figured out instantly what was going on, embraced in a display of brotherly love, realizing the care that they shared for each other. And so what you see behind me, although it's very abstracted, can you see the hands in the center? If you can't see the hands, find a buddy who can point out to you where the hands are. So the center of the painting, it looks like there are two arms crossing, and there are these lines that go down. To me, that looks like the grain sort of drifting down from as it's being released out of the hands. So it's a parable of love and care that I think is really resonant when you consider the times in which it was made. Although the world was rebuilding after World War II, the Cold War was still very much active. There's a lot of tension and division and conflict in the world. And so at that time, again, another dark time, another scary time, Krasnow was painting this topic that reminds us that a better world is possible through peace, through unity, through care. And there's the quote that runs along the sides reads, "How good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. That's from Psalm 133. So he was very invested in these themes of the human experience, brotherhood and care in this painting, things that repeat after again and again and again, and show us a way forward after dark and difficult times. So thank you very much, and I'm so excited to hear Kate and Ellie talk about Blacklist. Who's excited for that?